Well, as always, good afternoon to you folks. And, of course, you folks out there on the DVD program. Today is the Sabbath. And that's what I want to talk about today, the Sabbath. Now, those of us here today in this room have been keeping the Sabbath for a long, long time. And a lot of you folks out there, you've been keeping the Sabbath for a long, long time as well. However, there may be some of you who are new at keeping the Sabbath. And what I have to say today, some of it may be something, I may say something that some of us that's been keeping the Sabbath for a long time hasn't considered. But what does it mean to keep the Sabbath? What can we do on the Sabbath? And what should we refrain from doing on the Sabbath? If we're to understand the Sabbath, the most obvious place, in my way of thinking, would be Exodus 20. You know, this is where the Lord gave the Ten Commandments to Moses on Mount Sinai. Exodus chapter 20. Verse 8 tells us to remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. So we can take off from work on the Sabbath and we can go to church on the Sabbath. But what does it mean to keep the Sabbath holy? What does it mean for something to be holy anyway? Well, when something is holy, it belongs to God. All the furnishings in the tabernacle and later in the temple were deemed as being holy to God. All the gold which overlaid the altar, or it may have been brass, I don't know, but anyway, I know there was a lot of gold in the temple. All they had these golden pots and pans and basins and cups. All these were deemed as being holy to God. Even the clothes Aaron and his sons wore were holy to God, it tells us. In this instance, the Sabbath is declared to be holy, and we are to keep it. The law goes on to say, 6 days shall you labor and do your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord our God, or your God. In it you shall do no work. So we can see that 6 days of the week belong to us, but the seventh day belongs to God. And as we read on, we can see not only are we to refrain from work, but we are not to require work of others. You shall not do any work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, your manservant, nor your maidservant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger that is within your gates. Now, a lot of people look at this and they say, or they think that it's wrong to go out to a restaurant on the Sabbath and eat a meal in fellowship with brethren. Is this so? Is that what it's saying there? Does this mean if the gas man shows up on the Sabbath to fill up your tank that you should stop him from doing so? No. He doesn't work for you. He works for the gas company. Should you stop the mailman from bringing your mail on the Sabbath? No. He works for the government. Should we turn off our electricity on the Sabbath? Because there are people working on the Sabbath to provide us with electricity. If the UPS man shows up to deliver a package, should you refuse it? Well, of course not. He works for UPS. You are not his employer. Let's notice again what it says. It says, your daughter, your servant, or even your stranger or your cattle. It is the use of the possessive. It is talking about not requiring work from those who are under your control or those who are in your employment. Now, it would be wrong for you to have some company and you take off on the Sabbath and require your employees to continue to work. But it does not require us to prevent work by others, nor does it prevent us from benefiting from the labors of those who decide to work on the Sabbath. If that were the case, we couldn't meet in this room today, for someone had to bring the ice water in. Someone had to set up the tables, and someone had to turn on the lights. And it would be wrong for us to even purchase the use of this room for Sabbath services if that were the case. The people at the restaurants where we go to eat on the Sabbath are no different. They're going to work on the Sabbath whether we're there or not. They have chosen to work on that day, and their work habits are beyond our control. There's nothing we can do about it. Continuing on here in verse 11, here in Exodus 20. It says, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day." The Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So we can see from this passage of Scripture that the Sabbath day was created when man was created and was made holy right from the start. As Jesus puts it in the New Testament, the Sabbath was made for man. Now, man didn't own the Sabbath. It belongs to God. However, it was made for the benefit of man. Now, let's go over to Deuteronomy 5, for it adds another element to the Sabbath. Deuteronomy 5 and verse 15. It tells us, "And remember, you were a servant in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out with a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath." We see a people here who were born into slavery. They worked 7 days a week. They never knew what it was like to take a day off. Probably didn't even know the first day from the Sabbath. Of course, they may have. Now, all of a sudden, they had a day of worship, a day to pray, a day to think about God, and a day to rest as God Himself rested. Okay, so far we see that we're to keep the Sabbath day apart as belonging to God. We are not to work on that day as pertaining to our regular work. We are to rest on that day, and we are not required to work of others who are under our control on that day. We are to remember that our Creator rested on the Sabbath day, and that He liberated you from slavery. This is what the commandment itself says. However, the commandment itself raises a lot of questions. For example, just what is it that constitutes work? Now, the Pharisees, they had a whole list of stuff that represented work, or what they considered work. Well, you know, where do we draw the line? Well, as you read through the Bible, you begin to understand these two versions here in Exodus and Deuteronomy of the Ten Commandments are not all the Bible tells us about Sabbath observance. We also need to understand there is an important difference between the commandment itself and all other Scripture about the Sabbath. For all references to the Sabbath, or the rest of the other references, the other references to the Sabbath are called judgments. So what's the difference? I mean, you've read in the Bible about the commandments, the statutes, and judgments. Well, what's the difference between the commandment itself and a judgment about the Sabbath? Judgments are administrative statements applied to the law in specific situations, different situations. They're kind of like the amendments in our Constitution to the original law. Now, that may be a bad example, but you understand what I'm saying. The principle remains in force of the law itself, but it may not always have the same force or effect when applied to different circumstances in different times, in different ages, I should say. For we live in a different age than they did back then. And sometimes we have to apply the judgments in the Bible made about the Sabbath in different ways than they did. We live several thousand years down the road than from when some of these judgments were given. We live in the digital age. And as I said, some of these judgments has to be applied differently than when they were first given. However, it does not take away from the principal law. Now, all laws require interpretation. And if there is to be an official interpretation, then there must of necessity be an official administration to interpret those laws. Someone must have decision-making powers, in any government structure, and Israel was no different. The procedure for handling questions and disputes is described in Deuteronomy 17:8 for Israel, if you want to turn over there. We'll read about that. This is how it was. If there arises a matter too hard for you in judgment, between blood and blood, between plea and plea, between stroke and stroke, being matters of controversy within your gates or in your community, then you shall arise and get up and go to the place which the Lord your God shall choose. And you shall come unto the priest and the Levites and unto the judge that shall be in those days, and inquire. And they shall show you the sentence of judgment. And you shall do according to the sentence which they of that place which the Lord shall choose shall show you. And you shall observe to do accordingly to all that they inform you. So, if there arose a matter too hard for them to judge, especially matters creating controversy, they were to go to the seat of government and inquire of the priest and the Levite and the judges. It was these officials who were in charge with the responsibility of rendering judgments on doubtful matters. And their decisions took on all the force of law for those who had so inquired, even to the extent of death, the death penalty, as we can see here in verse 12. It says, and the man that will do so presumptuously and will not hearken unto the priest, and stands to minister before the Lord, or unto the judge, even that man shall die. And you shall put away the evil from Israel. Now, these judges and these priests, they could not just make up laws on their own. They had to derive their decision from the law of God and to support them by exposition of the law. Verse 11. It says, according to the sentence of the law which they shall teach you, and according to the judgments which they shall tell you, you shall do. You shall not decline from the sentence which they shall show you, to the right hand nor to the left. So if these people had a problem they couldn't resolve, they had to go to the priest, the Levites, and the judge. And whatever they told them, they were bound to do. It became law. Of course, they had, as I said, they had to derive their judgment from the original law and the original intent. It was kind of like our Supreme Court of today. Their decision, or these judgments, actually became part of the body of the law. That's why we find the biblical writers referring to the law in terms of commandments, statutes, and judgments. And like our Supreme Court of today, they sometimes made narrow decisions that applied only to the case in point, or a certain case. And sometimes they made broad decisions that could be applied to similar cases. Whatever they decided, however, had to be based, as I said, on the original law. And it became the law of the land, and it was binding. And of course, sometimes the judgment came from God himself. Well, paper's sticking together here. Let's go to Numbers 15 and look at a good example of this. 15, starting verse 27. It says, if any soul sin through ignorance, then he shall bring a she-goat of the first year for a sin offering. And the priest shall make an atonement for the soul that sins ignorantly, or just, not knowing that they were sinning at the time. And it shall be forgiven him. You shall have one law for him that sins through ignorance, both for him that is born among the children of Israel, and for a stranger that sojourns among them. In other words, the same law applied to both. It applied to everyone. Verse 30. But the soul that does so presumptuously, that's willfully sinning, whether he be born in the land or a stranger, the same which reproaches the Lord, that soul shall be cut off from among his people, because he has despised the word of God and has broken his commandment. That soul shall utterly be cut off. His iniquity shall be upon him. So we see that if a person sin, just not knowing, or just through ignorance, or not meaning to sin, there was an atonement for him, but not for the person who sinned willfully. The word presumptuously means to be arrogant, or to do something spitefully. In other words, you don't spit in God's face. He's not going to let you do that. In verse 32 through 36, it gives us an example of this. It says, and while the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man that gathered sticks on the Sabbath day. And they that found him gathering sticks brought him unto Moses and to Aaron, and unto all the congregation. And they put him in ward, or they locked him up, or somewhere, had him in, I don't know if they had jails back then, but anyway, they constrained him somewhere, because it was not declared what should be done to him. And the Lord said unto Moses, now this was the Lord's judgment on this man, the man shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones without the camp. And all the congregation brought him without the camp, and stoned him with stones, and he died, as the Lord commanded Moses. God brought this judgment down on this man because he had sinned willfully and spitefully in the face of God. Now, let's look at it from another perspective. What if there was another man who went out on the Sabbath to gather sticks, to build a fire because his wife was about to go into labor, and he needed to heat some water for obvious reasons? Or maybe he had a sick child, and he needed to keep him warm. Would the judgment have been the same? I mean, they were doing the same thing, but would the judgment passed be the same? Doubtfully. He probably would have not received the same judgment, for he was not doing it in a presumptuous manner. He was reluctantly doing it because of an emergency. And there is a difference. And it has to do with your intent of what you do on the Sabbath. It has to do with your intent. The first man here didn't act out of ignorance, weakness, or even necessity. His intent was to do something defiant against God. And Jesus would later make it clear that human and even animal necessity could create exceptions to the Sabbath law. And we'll look at that in a few moments. Now, before we go any farther, I want us to look at something very important, because what we've been reading here underlines a fundamental concept of Sabbath observance. And that would be yesterday. Friday, the preparation day is what I'm talking about. If you're going to need firewood on the Sabbath, you should go gather it before the Sabbath. In Exodus 16:4 through 30, there is a judgment. And although it doesn't pertain to us today, there are lessons which we can derive from this judgment and apply it in our own day and age. And that is when the Lord gave the children of Israel manna to eat. Now, we don't eat manna today, but there's still some lessons here that from this judgment that we can apply in our time. Exodus 16, started in verse 4. Then said the Lord unto Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain rate each day, that I may prove them, whether they will walk in my law or not. And it shall come to pass that on the 6th day they shall go out, they shall prepare that which they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. Now, we all know the story about manna, or should. They'd go out every day and gather what they needed of the morning, and when the sun came up, it melted and went away. And if they gathered more than they needed and they tried to keep it over, it bred worms and stank. They couldn't use it. It was their daily bread, except on the Sabbath. They could gather twice as much on Friday, so they would have enough to eat on the Sabbath. Now, verse 22 here. And it came to pass that on the 6th day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for it one man, and all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. And he said unto them, This is what the Lord has said, Tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. Bake that which you will bake today, and seethe that which you will seethe, and that which remains up lay over for you to be kept until the morning. And they laid it up until the morning, as Moses said, and it did not stink, nor was there any worms therein. And Moses said, Eat that today, for tomorrow is the Sabbath unto the Lord. Today you shall not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, which is the Sabbath, there shall be none. Well, Moses relayed all of this to the people. But what did some of them do? What did they do? It came to pass, it says, there went out some anyway, some of the people on the 7th day for to gather, and they found none. And the Lord said unto Moses, How long refuse you to keep my commandments and my laws? For the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore he gives you on the 6th day the bread of 2 days. Abide you every man in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. Now, since the Lord doesn't give us manna to eat today, what lessons can we learn from this judgment in our modern day society? Well, first, we learn the proper observance of the Sabbath requires forethought and preparation. God gave them a simple procedure. Gather enough for your family each day and eat it all. If you gather too much, try to hold it over. It'll get worms in it and it'll stink. stinking old manna. Then on the 6th day, you know, they were allowed twice as much so they could prepare for the Sabbath day. They learned, and we can also learn from this judgment, that we are to prepare for the Sabbath day. If we need groceries for the Sabbath, then we should go to the grocery store before the Sabbath comes. Now, what else can we learn? We learned that the Sabbath could not be just any day out of the 7. We learned that the Sabbath was established on a specific day. Those that went out on the Sabbath to collect manna found none, and they were rebuked for their efforts. We learned from these judgments that the Sabbath is on a specific day. We learned the proper observance of the Sabbath requires preparation. And there's nothing in the teachings of Christ down through the ages to change this judgment. It is still in force. It just has to be applied. We have to apply it in our day and age in a different way, for God doesn't give us manna. Now, what if you have a bunch of your relatives pile in on you on the Sabbath day, and you don't have enough groceries to feed them? Is it okay to go to the grocery store and buy groceries for them? Yes, it is. For there is a human need involved, and it was not your intent to break the Sabbath. It is an emergency, and in the administration of Jesus concerning the Sabbath, it is okay to take care of a true emergency on the Sabbath day, as we shall see. What we've been looking at so far is God's judgment for his nation Israel when he brought them out of slavery. These people had never known the Sabbath. They had to be taught, and they had to learn discipline regarding the Sabbath, and God had to give them these laws. Now, they had questions about the Sabbath in that day and age, and those questions had to be answered. And a lot of people have questions today about the Sabbath. That's the reason I wanted to talk about it today. Now let's go to Exodus 35 and verse 3. And we'll take a look at another piece of Scripture which is often misunderstood about the Sabbath. And sad to say, even by a lot of people in God's church today misunderstand this. Let's start back up in verse 2, 35:2. It says, 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh, there shall be to you a holy day, a Sabbath of rest to the Lord. Whosoever does work therein shall be put to death. You shall kindle no fire through your habitations upon the Sabbath day. Right there it is, the critics say. You're not to cook anything on the Sabbath, not to turn your stove on. Can't turn on the gas. Is that what Moses is implying here? Let's go back to Exodus 12 for just a moment. And here we see the same man, Moses, giving instructions received from the same Lord. This is concerning the first and last day of unleavened bread. Exodus 12 and verse 16. It says, in the first day there shall be a holy convocation, and in the 7th day there shall be a holy convocation to you. No manner of work shall be done in them, except that every man must eat. Okay? Now it says back there you're not to kindle the fire, but it tells you here that you can cook yourself something to eat. That only may be done of you. The weekly Sabbath is a holy day as well, people. And what applies to one applies to all except the Day of Atonement, of course. So is the Lord or Moses contradicting themselves here? No, they're not. Chapter 3 of Exodus 35, where it says you shall kindle no fire, is one of those scriptures that you must read in context in order to understand what Moses is talking about. If you read the whole 35th chapter, you will see it pertains to working on the tabernacle, We see here even the work on the tabernacle was to cease on the Sabbath. The implication is they were not to even build a fire on the Sabbath in preparation to resume work on the tabernacle until the Sabbath was over. It pertained to the working on the tabernacle. It did not mean they could not start a fire to keep warm if it was a cold day. And this is a judgment of Moses given on a specific occasion for a specific reason. However, it was put into the law and it has not been abolished. So again, we need to keep in mind judgments may be interpreted differently in different occasions. They were not to start a fire associated with working on the tabernacle. It doesn't mean they couldn't cook themselves, build a fire to cook, stay warm, or cook themselves something to eat. For if you and I kindle a fire on the Sabbath day, all we have to do is flip a switch, and the furnace comes on. No work at all. And we must understand there is no prohibition in any age, their age or our age, back then or now, to kindle a fire to stay warm. It is a matter of judgment. The concept is we must do all we can in preparation for the Sabbath so we can truly rest on the Sabbath day. But if an emergency arises, it's okay. Now let's go to Nehemiah, the 13th chapter, and look at this a little more. This is after the 70-year captivity of Israel by the Babylonians. Now Nehemiah and a group of people had come back to rebuild Jerusalem by the authority of the Persian king, Artaxerxes, I guess is how that's pronounced, and to restore the government of God in that city. In chapter 10, verse 13, chapter 10. One through 28, and we're not going to read that, but verse 1 through 28, we see a whole group of people who made up this list that came back, of whom I would call government officials, the government officials. And we will start reading in verse 28 here. It says, and the rest of the people, besides those people, the priests, the Levites, the porters, the singers, the Nethinim, which were a group of non-Jewish people, where they didn't have a Jewish background, but they assisted the Levites. It says, and all they that had separated themselves from the people of the lands unto the law of God, their wives, their sons, their daughters, everyone having knowledge and having understanding. They clave to their brethren, their nobles, and they entered into a curse and into an oath to walk in God's ways. This group of people made an oath to walk in God's ways, which was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe and do all the commandments of the Lord, our Lord, and his judgments and his statutes, and that we would not give our daughters unto the people of the land, nor take their daughters for our sons. Verse 33. And if the people of the land bring wares, or any victuals, or victuals, I think in the dictionary it just says V-I-T-L, I think. That'd be victuals, wouldn't it? Anyway, it's food on the Sabbath day to sell, that we would not buy it from them on the Sabbath or on the holy day. Now, the critics again like to use this scripture to say that we should not go out and eat on the Sabbath because it involves buying and selling on the Sabbath. Well, let's go on over to chapter 13, and we can get a little clearer picture of what was going on here. Verse 15. In those days, this is Nehemiah speaking here, says, in those days I saw in Judah some trading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in sheaves and lading asses, as also wine, grapes, figs, and all manners of burdens which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I testified against them in the day wherein they sold victuals, ever how you pronounce that. It says, there dwelt men of Tyre also therein, which brought fish and all manners of wire, and sold on the Sabbath unto the children of Judah and in Jerusalem. Then I contended with the nobles of Judah, and said unto them, what evil thing is this that you do, and profane the Sabbath? So apparently some of the nobles of Judah were going out and doing their weekly shopping on the Sabbath day. And that's what it would have been like. It would have been the equivalent of us going to the grocery store and doing our weekly shopping. Did not your fathers do this? And did not our God bring all this evil upon us and upon this city? Yet you bring more wrath upon Israel by profaning the Sabbath. And it came to pass that when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded that the gates be shut, and charged that they should not be opened till after the Sabbath. And some of my servants and I sat at the gates, that there should no burden be brought in on the Sabbath day. So the merchants and sellers of all kinds of wire lodged without Jerusalem once or twice. Then I testified against them, and said unto them, why lodge you about the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. Nehemiah was going to get rough with them. From that time forth, they no more came on the Sabbath. Now, Nehemiah was the governor of Jerusalem. Now, he couldn't do anything about these people selling outside the city, but he was governor of the city, and he had the authority to do so in the city, make these judgments. In those days, some of the Jews were carrying on their normal activities on the Sabbath inside Jerusalem, including setting up, or what we would call, a farmer's market or a flea market. And a lot of people were going out and doing their shopping on the Sabbath, and that is not what the Sabbath is for. So by means of a judgment or a city ordinance, Nehemiah, who was governor, forbade the marketing of produce and wares in Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. It wasn't like someone just walking through and buying an apple to satisfy their hunger. They were buying stuff to take home. They were doing their shopping. And again, that is not what the Sabbath day is for. And we've all seen those kinds of markets. And we can see how all that noise would disrupt the Sabbath day inside the city. Nehemiah set forth this judgment in an effort to prevent the people in Jerusalem from doing on the Sabbath day what they normally did on the other 6 days of the week. That's what he was trying to do. He was trying to establish a God or a Sabbath-keeping group of people, or a group of people that was following God's laws. And shopping on the Sabbath is wrong unless it is an emergency situation. This was a judgment of a governor to meet a specific situation. First of all, there is nothing in the fourth commandment to prohibit money or goods from changing hands on the Sabbath. The commandment is, you are not to do any work on the Sabbath. It is only the money or goods which pertain to your livelihood which should not be exchanged on the Sabbath. For when you do that, then it becomes work, and we are commanded not to work on the Sabbath. We can see an example of this in Amos, the 8th chapter, verse 4, concerning these crooked merchants. I'm not going to turn there, but it says, hear this, all you that swallow up the needy, even to make the poor of the land to fail, saying, when will the new moon be gone, that we may sell corn, and the Sabbath, that we may set forth wheat, making the ephah small and the shekel great, and falsifying the balances by deceit. Now, it wasn't wrong. It wasn't that it was wrong for these crooked merchants to purchase themselves something to eat to satisfy their immediate hunger on the Sabbath or the new moon. It was only wrong for them to buy and sell as pertaining to their livelihoods on these days, as we see. They couldn't wait for those days to be over so they could go back to work. What we've been reading thus far concerning judgments of the Sabbath have involved incidents in the Old Testament. Now let's look at the New Testament. I want us to look at the New Testament. Let's look at what the administration of Jesus was concerning the Sabbath. And as we read, we can see that Jesus' approach to the Sabbath was a common sense approach. By the time Jesus came on the scene, the Pharisees and religious leaders of that era had attached all kinds of things to the Sabbath that you could or could not do. They are referred to in the Bible as traditions. And there's nothing wrong with good traditions as long as they're based upon the original law. However, the laws that these religious leaders had attached to the Sabbath were laws of their own making and had nothing to do with the original intent. They had decided how far a person could walk on the Sabbath, how much one could carry, whether you could take things out of your house if it was on fire, and maybe the hem length of a woman's dress. I don't know. Some of you may know what I'm talking about. And when it came to Jesus, it was whether he could heal on the Sabbath or not. Jesus, for the most part, ignored the traditions of the Pharisees regarding Sabbath observance. Mark 2:23. Mark 2:23. And it came to pass that he, that is Jesus, that he went through the cornfields on the Sabbath day. Probably wasn't cornfields, it was probably wheat. But anyway, went through the cornfields on the Sabbath day, and his disciples began as they went to pluck the ears of corn. And the Pharisees said unto him, Behold, why do they do on the Sabbath that which is not lawful? So they had a law that you couldn't do this. The Pharisees had a law that you could not harvest not one head of grain on the Sabbath. And they challenged Jesus on the subject. They could see no difference between plucking one head of grain and harvesting your entire crop. The difference to them was just a matter of numbers. Now, common logic should tell anyone that there is a difference between plucking a few heads of grain to eat right there and then than harvesting your entire crop. What is the difference? The Pharisees could see no difference, but the difference is in your intent of what you're going to do. Let's take the example back in Exodus of, the man picking up sticks on the Sabbath. While one may have gone out to collect sticks on the Sabbath to build a fire to stay warm, might have gone unpunished, while the other man who did the exact same thing was stoned to death. It is all in your intent. And we can also add human need into that. While one man was reluctantly working to meet a human need, the other was arrogantly flouting God's law. Human need and intent makes all the difference in the world when it comes to keeping the Sabbath and keeping it holy. Jesus went on to ask, Have you never read what David did when he had need and was hungry? He and they that were with him. How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar, the high priest, and did eat the showbread, which is not lawful to eat for anyone except the priest, and gave also to them that were with him. And if you want to read that example, if you want to jot this down, that's in 1 Samuel chapter 21. And he said unto them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath also. This question, this answer or question which he put forth to the Pharisees, what did it have to do with the Sabbath? Simply that human need, hunger, or whatever it might be, on rare occasions, can take precedence over the law. However, these occasions in no way invalidates the law or sets the law aside. It is merely an exception to the rule on special occasions. Now let's go back to Matthew 12:5. This is the same incident, however, it adds a little more to it here. Jesus shows here that there can rise a conflict between two laws. Verse 5, he asked, or have you not read in the law how that on the Sabbath days the priest in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Now, no one's going to argue that the sacrificial law is greater than the Sabbath. But the priests were commanded to do all this work of killing and sacrificing all those animals, not only on the Sabbath, but every day. And the Sabbath forbade work. So which commandment took precedence here? Well, the sacrificial law did. Now we need to stop and consider what Jesus was trying to explain here to these people. He had already told them the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. He was trying to explain to them that man was not expected to worship the Sabbath itself, but to worship God on the Sabbath. And sacrificing all those animals were a part of the worship of God at that time. And besides, all those sacrifices pointed to Christ himself. After trying to explain this, he went on to say, but I say unto you that in this place is one greater than the temple. What he was saying is, if the service of the temple could continue on the Sabbath, even though it required work by the priest, required a lot of work, then so could the service of Christ. So could his service. Therefore, it was okay to do good and heal on the Sabbath. But they never got it. He then went on to tell them, if you had known what this means, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. So according to Jesus, the ritualistic observance of the law was not as important as mercy. And in verse 8 he concludes, for the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. In other words, Jesus has the final say-so as to the proper conduct on the Sabbath. Jesus explained the Sabbath day at a level no Pharisee could ever understand. And I'm afraid there are some people in the church today who doesn't understand it. In verse 10 here, it tells us there was a man with a withered hand. And they asked him if it was lawful to heal on the Sabbath day. Of course, they were trying to set a trap for him and trying to accuse him of doing something wrong. Because according to them, it was wrong to do anything on the Sabbath day that required work. Verse 11, he asked them, he said, what man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep, and it fall into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold on it and lift it out? Well, it was plain. All of them would have rescued the sheep. All of them would have done good for the sheep. Otherwise, his question would have been meaningless. But they didn't want him to do good for a human being. And over in Luke 14:5, I'm not going to turn there either, but he asked them a similar question. Which of you shall have an ass or an ox fall into a pit, and will not straightway pull him out on the Sabbath day? it was obvious that even the strictest Pharisee, even though it required hard physical labor, would save his animal. And Jesus, he knew how to rub it in on those people. Although they forbade work by anyone else on the Sabbath, well, it was okay for them to lift their own sheep out, Jesus taught that work is permissible on the Sabbath day in an emergency, even to save an animal. It's all in your intent and need. A human need, in this case, the need of an animal even. Then he really laid it on them. He said, how much more better is a man than the sheep? He said, you'd pull your sheep out, and how much better is a man than the sheep? Wherefore it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath days. Then he said to the man, stretch forth your hand. And he stretched it forth, and it was restored whole like the other. Now, you would think that such a dramatic healing right before their eyes would have been all was needed for those people to understand what was permissible on the Sabbath day, and would have been all the judgment Jesus needed to show them how to observe the Sabbath. But what did they do? It says they went out and conspired how they might destroy him. That's really unbelievable that people could see a dramatic healing like that and still accuse someone of doing wrong. On another occasion, John the 5th chapter, Jesus came across this impotent man who for 38 years had not been able to walk. In verse 8, John 5th chapter, verse 8, Jesus said unto this man, rise, take up your bed, and walk. And immediately the man was made whole, and took up his bed and walked. And on the same day was the Sabbath. This man was down there by a certain pool of water, and with a lot of other sick people. And I don't know how all that worked, but it said when the angel came to trouble the water, whoever got in the water first was made whole. And this man was crippled. He couldn't get in there. So Jesus healed him there on the spot. These religious leaders had defined how much a person could carry on the Sabbath. And when they saw this man carrying his pallet, they said in verse 10, they told him, said, it is not lawful you to carry your bed. He answered them and said, he that made me whole, the same said unto me, take up your bed and walk. This man had no question about Jesus having the credentials to interpret the Sabbath. Any man who could heal him certainly had the power to explain proper Sabbath observance. Some people look at this and say that Jesus invalidated the Sabbath. Is that so? Well, I'm not going to turn there either, but you can jot it down. Jesus says in Matthew 5:17, think not that I have come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill, or rather, I have come to magnify the law. Truly I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, not one jot, not one tittle, shall in no wise pass from the law. So no, Jesus did not do away with the Sabbath or any of the laws. What concerned Jesus about these Pharisees and these religious leaders of the day was the trivializing of the Sabbath and the laws. These religious leaders could see no difference between carrying a 100-pound sack of potatoes on your back and a rolled-up blanket under your arm. And there is a difference, but you can't measure it in ounces and pounds, folks. Once again, it is a matter of intent, and Jesus told him to do it. And once again, because he had healed on the Sabbath day, they sought to kill him. When they confronted Jesus on the matter, Jesus said, verse 30, let me see, where were we at? Well, he said, I can of my own self do nothing. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I seek not my own will, but the will of my Father, which has sent me. It was not God's intent to prevent man from carrying something light on the Sabbath, like that man with his rolled up blanket under his arm. It is not God's intent to prevent man from doing good on the Sabbath, or doing a little labor if it's an emergency. It is his intent to set man free from his regular weekly routine so that he can come and worship his Creator on the Sabbath. Jesus' judgment about the Sabbath was also the Father's judgment and the Father's intent. It is the original intent and interpretation of the Sabbath law. Now, there was no way that Jesus could answer all the questions that would arise about the Sabbath, so especially in the generations to come. You know, because the generations to come, technology would advance. Therefore, there is a continuing need for the interpretation of the Sabbath law in our modern age. Because a lot of those things back then don't apply to us today. And a lot of things today was never heard of back then. Matthew 16:19. Jesus tells the apostles, he says, and I will give unto you the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Now, this doesn't give anyone the power to change the laws of God, not the apostles or anyone else, but only the power to make judgments on the original intent, as they did back in Exodus, on doubtful matters. The ministry is not to decide for people what they can decide for themselves. In the Old Testament times, as well as today, it is only for those things too hard for the people to make a decision on. And this includes matters of controversy. It has become part of the tradition of the church, supported by God Himself. Using the principle that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath, we have long determined that while it is wrong to work at your regular job on the Sabbath, it is not wrong for you to benefit directly or indirectly from the work of others who have decided to work on that day, because you have no control over those people. For to determine otherwise, we couldn't turn the furnace on the Sabbath day. We'd have to sit there and freeze all day long. In the summer, we couldn't turn the air conditioner on. Sit there and wipe sweat, which might be breaking the Sabbath. We couldn't turn the stove on to heat us up something to eat. We'd have to light our candles late Friday evening, so we wouldn't be lighting a fire on the Sabbath day. You couldn't even flush the commode or wash your face on the Sabbath day, if we were to determine otherwise. You couldn't even drive your car to church on the Sabbath, for someone probably worked on the Sabbath to build that car and provide the fuel that runs it. And for anyone to become this pharisaical about the Sabbath is to defeat the very purpose of the Sabbath itself. And believe it or not, I've ran across a few people in this modern day and age who interpret the commandment this way. By following this approach, we're going far beyond the requirements of what the law requires, just as the Pharisees did. To properly keep the Sabbath, we must consider the matter of intent. Take into consider the matter of intent. Now, if you'll go to Isaiah 58, starting to verse 3, we will see the right attitude and the right purpose for keeping the Sabbath. Isaiah 58 and verse 13. It says, if you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord honorable, and shall honor him, not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasures, nor speaking your own words, then shall you delight yourself in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride upon the high places of the earth. And I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken it. That is the right attitude and right intent for keeping the Sabbath. So what is the true purpose and intent of the Sabbath? It is to take roughly 24 hours out of the other 168 that make up the week, and to pause and find a little time for your God, your friends, your family, and to fellowship with your brethren. It is time to study the Word of God, that you might better understand how to live the other 144 hours of the week. It is not a day to sit wrapped up in a blanket, shivering, because you're afraid to light the fire in the fireplace, or to flip the switch to turn the furnace on. It is not a time to sit in the dark, because you're afraid to turn on the lights, thinking you'll be breaking the Sabbath. It is not a day to go hungry, because you're afraid to turn the stove on and cook you a hamburger. It is not a day to be alone, because you won't go out to a restaurant and fellowship with your brethren. However, remember, it is God's day, a day in which you have time for prayer, a time for studying the Bible, a time for your children, a time for yourself, a time for meditation, and above all, a time for God.